I'm honored to welcome you today to Career Month 2019. We are pleased to have you join us for today's webinar entitled How to Succeed as a First-Time Executive. My name is Linda Pentel, and I work with the Alumni Career Development Team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. All November long, we are bringing you a month of free online career programming tailored for UChicago alumni of all degree types, years, industries, and backgrounds. Each program is an opportunity to learn from successful Maroons who are leading at the top of their fields, and we're so glad you could join us today. Our speaker is Eric Friedman. Eric is a professional marketer, strategy executive, and executive coach, and is joining us today as a first-time volunteer. We are honored to have him, and it's my pleasure to hand the controls over to Eric.
Thanks, Linda, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Linda and the University of Chicago Alumni Association for inviting me to participate in Career Month programming. And I'm really thrilled to speak on this topic of how to be a successful first-time executive, drawing on some of my own experience years ago, as well as my more recent experience as an executive coach. So let's go ahead and get started. So today's agenda, we're going to start off by talking briefly about what an executive is, and specifically within the context of an organization, how executive responsibilities evolve over time. We'll talk then about the first-time executive's top 3 priorities, the key success factors for first-time executives in addressing those priorities, and then we'll conclude, and I'll try to save some time at the end for some questions and answers. So one of the earliest and probably one of the most most influential works on what it means to be an executive is Peter Drucker's famous book, The Effective Executive, which was published over 50 years ago in 1967. And I thought this would be a good place to start. According to Drucker, executives are those knowledge workers, managers, or individual professionals who are expected by virtue of their position or their knowledge to make decisions in the normal course of their work that have impact on the performance and results of the whole. I italicized just a couple parts of that definition, particularly about making decisions that have an impact on the performance of the organization as a whole. I think that's key to what it means to be an executive, and it's important to have this in mind as you approach your first executive assignment, or as you're working with someone else who might be doing the same. The organization could be a department, it could be a business unit, or it could be an enterprise overall, whichever unit you have leadership responsibility for. So this slide is not from Peter Drucker's work. It's the result of conversations that I've had with some management professors and my own experience as well. But I call this the 4 stages of the executive life cycle. And as you probably already know, the work that we do in organizations professionally evolves over time. The scope of influence grows from a single individual to an entire enterprise. Issues and problems become more complex. And while initially most of the work that we do has to do with analysis, taking complex problems, breaking them down, and then working on their individual parts, over time, as our responsibilities and influence in the organization grow, we spend more time on synthesis, which demands that we view and place these increasingly complex issues and problems within a larger context. There we go. So as you step into your first executive role, I think it's a good idea to keep this model in the back of your head, because one of the points I'd like to make today in our conversation is that whatever role you happen to play in an organization at any given time, you should always have in your back of your mind what the next logical role for you might be, and ensure that whatever you're doing in your current role is in some way preparing you for the next role. The other point that I'd like to make about this is that the pace at which an executive progresses along this trajectory from managing projects to inspiring people is really a function of how quickly you can learn about your new role. And learning is really, to my mind, a function of two variables. Curiosity, which really sort of has to do with closing a drive to close an information gap between what we currently know and what we need to know. And also intellectual humility, which is kind of a happy medium between intellectual arrogance or overconfidence, overcertainty at one extreme, and intellectual diffidence, which is uncertainty or a lack of confidence in what we believe on the other. So as I mentioned, and as the title of this presentation suggests, this presentation is really designed for first-time executives, someone who's managed projects in small groups of people and now find themselves in a role that requires them to formulate policy and, as Peter Drucker points out, make decisions that impact the entire unit of which they're a part. So to use our wayfinding map, we're located about here on the executive trajectory. So before we go any further, I'd like to ask Linda's assistants to conduct a very brief poll. And I'm just curious, within the audience, how many years of experience do each of you have in an executive role? And then Linda will give us a quick report out on the results.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing. So it looks like we have a few responses coming in, but overwhelmingly, we're about at 55%. I have never held an executive role, about 22% of 1 to 3 years, and then 11%, 3 to 5, looking at reporting less than 10% for the other two options.
Okay, good. So that's what I had hoped for, and hopefully this presentation will be of use to you and of value to you. Okay. So let's move on to, from my point of view, at least what I view as the first-time executive's top 3 priorities. And the very first is making up your mind that you're going to exceed your performance objectives. And note that I said exceed and not meet your performance objectives. Of all of the different variables that can have an impact on your success as a first-time executive, this is probably going to be the most influential of all of them. If you can accomplish this goal, if you can consistently exceed your performance objectives, you'll be well positioned for promotion and taking on additional responsibilities down the road. But of course, it's really difficult to do so unless we have the assistance and the help of a great team of colleagues. And so I've listed as the second of the top 3 priorities, building a high impact team. And then finally, once you're on your road to putting your team together, meeting your objectives, you can spend some time developing your own sense of self in your new role, what I would call executive presence. As we're going to see a few slides down the road, executive presence is really your ability to mobilize people to act. And when it's developed, it will significantly increase the probability that you'll be able to exceed your performance objectives, as well as attract high caliber colleagues to your team. So once you've made progress on developing your executive presence, you'll have created a virtual circle that will accelerate your progress along that trajectory that we just looked at of executive life cycle. So let's talk about some of the key success factors for each of these top 3 priorities. And the first I would identify as setting achievable but ambitious high-level objectives. That's always the starting point. I'm going to caution you from setting those objectives too soon into your new role. We'll talk a little bit about that a few slides later. But clearly, your work begins with setting the appropriate, ambitious, but also achievable high-level objectives. And they need to be ambitious because you want to create objectives and set objectives for yourself that cause you to stretch, because that's the only way you're going to grow as an executive. And the same can be said for your team. If you set stretch objectives for them, they're going to discover themselves achieving goals that they never thought they could accomplish, and that's a wonderful growth engine for growth. It's also important to focus on opportunities and not problems. Most of the goals that you set as an executive and as a first-time executive are going to either involve growth of some kind or the development of some type of new organizational capability. My guidance here is to not assign your best high potential people to fixing problems, but rather assign them to working on opportunities, because down the road, only opportunities are going to move your organization forward. I know one organization that asks its executives twice a year to compile 2 lists, one of the most significant opportunities that the organization faces, and the other a list of the top performing executives on the team. What they do is they socialize those lists, they reach a consensus, and then they match up high-level executives with a particular opportunity. Once you've got your goals established and you're beginning to work on them, I think it's really important that you track progress in a visible place. It's really, really important that people have a clear sense always of how well you're doing toward achieving your goals. And with every goal on your list, there should be clear milestones associated. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the concept of SMART goals. These are goals that are simple, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're realistic, and they're time-bound or timely. And every goal should have 1 or more milestones associated with it so that you can track intermediate objectives as well as your higher level objectives. In addition to that, any work that your team does should be associated with a particular milestone, which of course is also then associated with a high level objectives. So you want to make sure that any project or initiative that your team is working on ladders up to a SMART goal or milestone, which then ladders up to a higher level a higher level objective. And then finally, it's really important to share progress and celebrate success for each of these key success factors. And every piece of progress that you make toward goals and objectives. Even if things aren't going well, or maybe even particularly when things aren't going well, it's very important to find something that you can celebrate that will inspire your team and make sure they understand that the work that they're doing has value and is of use. So with respect to building a high impact team, clearly you want to recruit for required core competencies. And this is something that you can begin to think about as you begin to formulate your higher level objectives. The objectives and the mission of your team, your group, your business unit, your functional unit, or your enterprise is going to drive the kind of skills that you're going to need to have a successful and lead a successful organization. Identify the knowledge and skills your unit's going to need to achieve objectives, and then hire for these core competencies. One possibility a lot of people forget to take into consideration is that you don't always have to hire outside people to provide you with the core competencies, the skills, and the knowledge that you need. It's also possible to work with other units in your enterprise or your organization and find a way to partner with them to gain access to the capabilities and the competencies that you need. Clearly communicate progress toward goals and milestones. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Again, the intention here is to make sure that everyone on your team is always clear about where you stand relative to the progress you're making toward your high-level goals and milestones. Perfect the art of delegation. This is really, really challenging for first-time executives. And you know, I think the problem oftentimes is that we don't believe that other people are capable of doing work as well as we might do it. And as a result of that, we keep a tight grip on projects that that we might well delegate to other people on our team. You know, I think it's important for all of us to get over our egos in this sense and to recognize that other members of our team are almost always capable of doing the job as well as we can. They might do it in a way that's different than the way we might approach it, but my advice here is to always trust your team and whenever possible, delegate tasks to them so that you can focus on higher level, more strategic issues. Develop team members through real-time, on-the-spot feedback. One of my managers once told me that if you're in an annual performance review conversation with someone that works for you, and there are any surprises in that conversation, then you really haven't done your job as a manager. And he always encouraged me to take advantage of every possible opportunity I could to help my team members grow through real-time, on-the-spot feedback. And you know, simply that means praise publicly and criticize privately as soon after an opportunity presents itself. So it's better to do it on the spot rather than wait 24 hours or 48 hours. You know, if you have a suggestion to make for improving performance, take your individual team member aside and offer that feedback privately. But there's nothing that incents and inspires a team member more than being praised in public. So if you have an opportunity to recognize someone on your team for doing a great job, take every opportunity you can to do so publicly. And then last, and this is of course very difficult for first-time managers and first-time executives, it's really important to promptly remove non-performing individuals as quickly as possible. You owe it to your organization and you owe it to your other team members to remove non-performers, move them to another more suitable or appropriate role in the organization, or if that's not a possibility, transition them out of the organization. It's better to do that sooner rather than later. Waiting can be deadly. So the third priority is cultivating executive presence, and there's been a lot spoken on this topic. There's been a lot of ink spilled on this topic, but one of the best definitions and descriptions of executive presence comes from Suzanne Bates' great work, The Science of Influence. And what she has to say about executive presence is what is intuitively understood about executive presence is that it's all about the capacity to mobilize others to act. At the core, it's necessary for influencing others. To stand out and drive an organization forward, you must own the room, project an authentic and confident style, excite people's imaginations, and win hearts and minds. So the way I think about executive presence is like this. The difference between the title that you hold and executive presence is the difference between formal authority and influence. My experience has been that by and large, people will do exactly what you tell them to do when they're responding to your positional or situational authority. But they'll likely do much more when they're responding to your personal influence, which is one of the results and the products of executive presence. Authority evolves the exercise of power and pushes people forward. Influence, on the other hand, activates a positive emotional response from others and pulls people forward. And the most successful first-time executives that I've had the opportunity to work with utilize both of these levers. So when I talk about executive presence, I have sort of three elements, or what I call three pillars in mind. The first is confidence. It's a sense of personal efficacy and agency. You know, it's a sense of belief in your own ability to get the job done. You know, unfortunately, as human beings, we have a negative bias, which is why we're almost more critical of ourselves than we are of other people. So I urge you that when that negative bias, when that temptation to start becoming overly critical of yourself begins to show up, find a way to redirect your thinking toward a more positive direction. And one of the ways that I urge my clients to do this, and I do myself, is to remind yourself of all of the successes you've had in your career at this point. And that's it's a wonderful way of redirecting your attitude and your sort of sense of direction from a less than positive to a more positive attitude. Humility is very important. I don't think in any way that humility and confidence are at odds with each other. Overconfidence or arrogance is clearly the opposite of humility, but I think it's entirely possible to be both confident and humble at the same time. And when I talk about humility, I'm really referring to kind of an intellectual curiosity and a willingness to acknowledge that there are things I don't know. To me, humility means the courage to say, here's what I believe, what do the rest of you think? And then pausing in that point and listening attentively and carefully to the different points of view and perspectives and opinions of the other people that you work with an intention of keeping an open mind and revising your own views on the subject if you think it's appropriate to do so. The third pillar is what I call altitude. And I think the easiest way to describe that is having a strategic perspective. Some writers refer to this as a view from the balcony, but it's an understanding of why the work I do is important to the rest of the organization. Not only why it's important, but how it's important. And oftentimes, a client will ask me, you know, how can I prove to other people in the organization that I have strategic perspective? And one of the pieces of advice I'll give a client is to spend some time identifying a point of view on each and every opportunity and challenge your organization is facing. Do some research, collect the data, and develop a point of view or an opinion on it, so that when that topic comes up in a meeting or in a conversation with another executive, you know what you think about the topic, and you know how to clearly communicate your point of view to the other individual. Always be prepared to state your opinion and your perspective on key opportunities and challenges, but of course, you know, supported always by hard facts and good data. So that begs the question of how to develop executive presence. And here are some thoughts that I have. You know, find a mentor or a coach, especially if this is a first-time executive role. Mentors and coaches are important because, you know, as our organizational work transitions from analysis to synthesis, we need access to additional resources of knowledge and expertise. We need access to people who are capable of helping us see our blind spots. And because the stakes are so high in these kinds of roles, they tend to be emotionally volatile and emotionally impactful. It's really a great idea to find someone that we can trust and confide in. Ideally, someone who stands outside of our organization's current chain of command. Mentors and coaches, by the way, play two very different roles. The difference between a mentor and a coach is that mentors typically work with their clients on a voluntary basis. They're not compensated. Coaches are compensated. Coaches generally, not always, but generally have been professionally trained and certified, whereas mentors rely almost exclusively on the power of their own personal professional experience. So each is useful and valuable in their own way. My experience has also been that successful executives, the most successful executives, create a disciplined habit of self-reflection. Self-reflection is without a doubt the best way of increasing your own self-awareness, which of course is one of the 4 foundations of emotional intelligence. I've noticed that that people find time for self-reflection in a variety of different ways. Some executives spend some time at the end of the day reflecting on something new that they've learned over the course of the day and something that they're going to do different the next day, which is going to hopefully make them a more effective executive tomorrow than they were today. Other executives utilize more formal mechanisms. After action reviews are very popular as a way of kind of bringing the team together after an initiative or project has ended to find out what happened, why it happened, and what the team might do differently in the future to affect a different outcome. Actively solicit feedback, and this is this is easier said than done because again, human beings, being the creatures that we are oftentimes reluctant to offer feedback. They feel uncomfortable offering feedback. But I think it's really, really important to create the level of psychological safety in your organization that encourages and rewards people for actively soliciting feedback on your own performance as an executive. This is especially true for people who report to you because clearly they're going to be the individuals who are most reluctant to share that kind of information with you. One of the ways, the most effective ways I've found to overcome our reluctance to offer feedback is to train the folks we work with not only in the discipline of offering feedback, but also help them learn how to ask for feedback, because it's easier to give our feedback to someone if they've approached us and asked for it. And then the fourth is, relentlessly pursue clarity of communication. And I have in mind communication around a number of issues. First, about your vision for your organization, your sense of purpose, why you think the work you do is important. And I hope that as first-time executives, you'll take every opportunity to make that case. Why your team's work matters, both to the organization at large, but also with respect to their own professional progress. About performance expectations, and clearly this goes all the way back to the very first priority of exceeding your performance goals. This is much easier to do if you've already outlined in very clear language what your goals are, what the supporting milestones are, and how all of the work that all the members in your team are doing relate to those milestones and goals. And then, specifically when giving feedback. With respect to the general topic of communication and executive communication in particular, I have a couple of suggestions to offer. First of all, I think it's really important, and we tend to not be aware when we're doing this, but it's really important to always speak out of a sense of optimism. Always focus on what's possible in the future and try to avoid belaboring what didn't work in the past. There's no better way to suck inspiration and energy out of a room than going back over all of the things that an organization or a team has tried in the past but failed. It's demoralizing, it's dispiriting, and it's certainly not a hallmark of a successful executive. I think it's important to learn and remember to communicate at a level of detail that's appropriate to the individual or the group that you are communicating with. I'm working with a client who is the head of an engineering organization, an engineering team for a large consulting firm based out of Washington, D.C., and he's being groomed for general management responsibilities within the organization. He gets frustrated sometimes because the CEO will come down the hall and ask him a question, And he'll start answering the question, but after a very short period of time, the CEO will lose interest and say, okay, thanks, and then continue on down the hall. And you know, we've worked on this a lot, and one of the things that we've discovered is that, you know, because his functional expertise and training has been almost exclusively in the field of engineering, details and data are very, very important to him. So whenever someone asks him a question, and it might be a relatively simple question that could be answered within 3 or 4 sentences, he regresses to his previous training and he just spews data out all over the place. And of course, that's more detail than a senior level executive is interested in taking on at that point. So generally, you know, what we've been working on is developing, you know, what I call kind of a sorting process, that when someone asks him a question, he does a quick sort and identifies the one particular issue that individual's most interested in hearing about, and then tailoring his response to that one particular issue. If he's got more to say on the subject, he can always follow up with an email outlining any additional information or data that he thinks is relevant to provide. And that leads me to a third suggestion that I would make to the first-time executive, which is short sounds confident. The less you say, the more people are going to pay attention and value the few words that you do have to offer. So always resist the temptation to go on. And if you feel that you're saying too much, bring the conversation, or at least your end of the conversation, to a close. So I want to circle back to this subject of self-reflection and developing disciplined habits of self-reflection. You know, my chosen model of self-reflection is mindfulness meditation. I've had a long time practice of meditation, and I'm curious of the people that are on the webinar this afternoon. I wonder if you'd mind sharing how you practice self-reflection in your own personal, professional life, and as a way of increasing your self-awareness. Go ahead and reply in the, I guess the question box is best for this, right, Linda?
Yes, I'm looking at both the questions or the chat, so whatever you prefer, but I'm seeing a few results come in already. Journaling, sporadic meditation, stream of consciousness journaling, that one is pretty popular. Writing a list of what is going well and what needs improved. So you have a lot of good journalers here. Asking your friends for feedback. Trying to complete an everything I've done each day list. Keeping a personal mission statement. Working on slowing down, being more in the moment. Specifically setting aside time to think and reflect. That one seems to be popular. Doing a 360 feedback or more specific leadership assessments. Good Post-it note reminders on your wall. Yeah. Making that more salient. Taking a walk. I'm seeing some good, you know, physical tricks here. Taking holidays. Make sure to get some of your own away time. Setting aside goals and reviewing them on a quarterly basis. We're seeing something about this regular scheduling seems to be an undercurrent of this.
Well, these are great.
Yeah, thank you everyone for these suggestions.
Thanks for sharing that. And I just want to comment on a couple of them. Journaling is really an outstanding way of sort of getting to the heart of what's going on in your life at a particular time, and accessing a level of information which is oftentimes exists well below our level of consciousness. I love the idea of a personal mission statement. I think that's very important to do, and not only to create a personal mission statement, but sort of if you can create the time and set the time aside, start your day and end your day with it. Remind yourself what you're about and what you're going to set out to do over the course of the day, and then at the end of the day, take a few minutes to stop and reflect back over on how your day went and how well you behaved and whether or not you behaved in a way that's aligned with your personal mission statement. Creating the time is really important, and I think the best way to do that, without doubt, is literally creating a calendar entry, setting aside time to sort of spend in self-reflection. I do think that given how busy we are in our professional lives, if anything's going to go by the wayside, it's going to be personal time for reflection. So I think it's really important to carve out time in advance. Vacations and downtime, it's very, very easy for us to persuade ourselves that we don't have the luxury of taking a vacation because we're so busy and we're so indispensable to everyone else in the organization. But that is very high risk behavior. You need to find time to get out of the office. My experience has been that I can't always afford to take more than a week at a time, but my experience has been that it takes me at least a week to really sort of get out of the work mode and find a place of relaxation that allows me to recharge. And of course, that's not always a luxury we can afford, but it's important to try to find larger chunks of time to really make that break with the office. Some of the walking, I think, is very powerful. Running, making sure that you have. Some people do the best thinking about their own lives when they're working out. I have a very close friend of mine who pursues what she calls contemplative photography, and she goes out of her way to try to find things that she has never seen before, or things that she's accustomed to seeing but is now able to see in a new way. And she's created this beautiful photography that she attributes in her own life to significantly expanding her own sense of self-awareness and what's important to her. So these are great. Thank you for sharing these. Now, as a kind of bonus, I want to share something with you that I think is probably the most important piece of advice and recommendation I could make to anyone who finds themselves for the first time in an executive role. And let me frame this by saying that most first-time executives feel under tremendous pressure to prove that whoever hired or promoted them made a right decision. They feel compelled to make their mark very quickly. And this is often a very serious mistake. As a first-time executive, you're at a distinctive disadvantage. You know less than your predecessor, if there was a predecessor in your particular role. And you also, if you're stepping into a new role that leads an existing team, it's also very likely that you know less than your individual team members. So I think it's really, really important to listen and learn, and make learning a top priority the minute that you step into a new executive role. Observe, suspend judgment, talk with as many different people as you possibly can, while always keeping your eye open for personal agendas. If you are new to an executive role, people in the organization, some people in the organization, I should say, will view this as an opportunity to further their own personal agenda with you. So you need to be very careful and judicious about assessing what people tell you, at least to yourself. That said, when you interview people or when you talk to people, don't interrogate or interview or signal that you're assessing every word that they say. You can certainly do so, but keep that to yourself. Listen actively and confirm what you're hearing from others is the same, so that you can make sure that you're all on the same page. So my advice and I think, again, the most important piece of advice I can give to a first-time executive is move slow, learn first, act later. So what do you do after this webinar? If you go back to if you're new in an executive, if you're a first-time executive, you're new to your role, What steps can you take to significantly improve the chances that you're going to be successful? Well, clearly listen, listen, listen. Make listening and learning your top priority, at least during your first 30 days on the job. Some people would argue that that probably ought to extend to your first 60 or even 90 days on the job, but oftentimes that's unrealistic. So my advice is at least during your first 30 days on the job, and try to avoid making any important decisions at this time, because these are decisions that, because you make them without a full benefit of the information you need to know to make an informed decision, you may well end up regretting down the road. Next, build your plan and communicate it clearly to your manager and your team. I suggest building a variety of different plans, laddering plans, a 30-day plan, 90-day, 180-day plan, and then an annual plan that shows how you intend to achieve near-term, mid-term, and longer-term objectives. Clearly, your 30-day plan is going to be listen, 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 and it ought to involve steps that you're going to be taking to learn as much as you possibly can about your new role and the impact it's going to have on the organization at large. As early as possible, identify the schedule, the purpose, and the structure of each of your regularly recurring meetings, and start holding these meetings as soon as possible. You know, your meetings with your manager, your meetings with each individual team member, with your team as a whole. I recommend having individual one-on-one meetings with each of your team members. Of course, it depends on how many direct reports you have, but I think it's a great idea to meet with each of your team members at least once a week. If you can't afford the time to meet with your team as a whole weekly, then perhaps you know, bi-monthly, every 2 weeks, and your manager is going to determine how often he or she would like to meet with you. And then last but not least, again, I'll circle back to this, you know, consider working with a mentor or coach to help you learn and get up to speed as quickly as you possibly can. And even more importantly, to help you avoid falling victim to your own blind spots. So to conclude the remarks I have today, and then we'll have some time for some questions and discussion, I really want to impress upon you that leadership is a lifelong journey, not a specific destination. I recently read a wonderful book by an executive coach by the name of Jerry Colonna. And the title of the book is Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. And Colonna makes a really interesting point. He's a much sought after CEO coach. He works almost exclusively with CEOs of startup organizations, particularly tech startups. And the point that he makes repeatedly in his book is that becoming a leader is really all about becoming an adult and growing beyond all of the habitual behaviors, assumptions, and mindsets that we developed earlier in life, especially when we were children, trying to figure out ways to survive for many of us in dysfunctional families. So leadership is a lifelong journey. It's not a specific destination. And you know, it's important to recognize that when you step into an executive role for the first time, this role is fundamentally different from the roles of an individual contributor or a manager. You're making decisions, and you're making key decisions that have an impact on the entire organization or the unit you lead. So it's important to recognize those differences. Approach your first executive assignment with an eye toward building capacity for future assignments and responsibilities. Keep that executive life cycle trajectory in mind, and always remind yourself of the skills you're going to need to develop in order to be prepared for your next assignment. And to the extent possible, find ways and opportunities for developing those skills. The 3 priorities: prioritize exceeding goals, building impactful teams, and cultivating executive presence. And last but not least, make learning quickly a top priority. Resist moving too quickly in an effort to make your mark. So those are the comments and the observations I have to share with you today. We've got, looks like, about 15 minutes left. Happy to discuss any questions or any observations that you might have on this topic.
Great, thank you, Eric. This was really helpful, and we do have a lot of good questions in here. So we're going to start the Q&A, but please continue to send them in. Eric, what would you advise if you are stepping into a newly created executive role at a company who has not had that position before?
Well, I guess the first question I would ask is, why was this role created? We might assume that the organization had been doing perfectly well up to a certain point, and then something changed. What was it that changed? Did the organization's mission in some sense change? Did the competitive environment change? Has there been a larger restructuring within the organization? Has that taken place, which created this new executive role? I think the very, very first question you have to ask yourself is, why was this role created in the first place? Because that should provide you with a great deal of information about what your managers and the other senior executives in the organization, what their expectations are going to be for you in this role.
Great, thank you. You gave a few examples to this, but I'm getting several questions. I'd like to talk about it a little more. You know, there might be an inherent assumption that an executive role is a promotion within an organization, or if you're being groomed for it. But what advice would you give to an individual on maneuvering, landing an executive role in an external organization if you haven't been groomed for it, and perhaps if you have additional, you know, a non-traditional background, for instance, a lawyer or a doctor moving into an executive role at another type of company?
So I'll provide you with one example that happened to me really, really early in my career. Way back a long time ago, I was working as a high school English teacher. And I was working at a private school in Kansas City and decided that I really wasn't cut out for high school teaching. I enjoy teaching, but at the collegiate and graduate student level. But I decided that I really wanted to go into business. And so the challenge, it was by no means an executive role, but I think what I'm going to suggest is equally applicable. I mean, I was looking to enter the world of business through an analyst role. And the biggest challenge for me was to find a way to translate whatever experience and skills I developed as a graduate student at the University of Chicago, as well as a high school English teacher, and translate those skills and knowledge into the requirements that any analyst role might involve. So I think you have to think about, always work from your strengths, I guess is a piece of advice that I would give you if you're trying to transition into a non-traditional role or a role that's outside your particular, your current field. Work from your strengths, identify what your strengths are in your current job, and then find out how to translate each one of those strengths into a skill or competency that the kind of job you're interested in pursuing will require. And I think that's almost the only way to do it. If you don't have previous experience in the field or the role to fall back on, again, work from your strengths and do the best you can to make a case for why those skills and capabilities carry over to a new role.
Thank you. Eric, you spoke about the importance of focusing on opportunities, not problems. Could you give us some examples of what an opportunity and what a problem is in that situation? How to make that reframe?
Sure. So when I think about opportunities, I think the best way to identify opportunities is to take stock of all of the changes that are occurring either within your organization or outside your organization, in the market, or in the industry more generally in which you work. Change always creates opportunities. So, I'm trying to think of an example. Here's a great example of an opportunity lost. It's cited in a lot of business school cases, but it has to do with Kodak, which was for many years, the market leader and really, one might say, the monopoly provider of photographic equipment and supplies. And as computer technology and information technology evolved, it created an entirely new field of digital photography. That was a huge opportunity that Kodak entirely missed, and they never actually recovered from it. Some people make the same case for Motorola failing to make the transition from analog communication devices to digital communication devices. So identifying opportunities, an easy way to identify, or not an easy way, but an effective way to identify opportunities, is to take stock of all of the changes that are occurring within your organization or in the industry outside your organization, and sort of ask yourself, how might we take advantage of these changes? What kinds of new opportunities are these changes creating? And with respect to problems, problems might be, I would not include something like how do we increase a market share, because that's really an opportunity. I would view that as an opportunity. A problem is a situation that prevents an organization from growing, from progressing, from being the best possible enterprise it can be. And it typically involves fixing something that's broken. That work has to be done. Problems need to be fixed. They need to be addressed. My key point is not to avoid them, not to ignore them, but resist the temptation to assign your high-performing people to fixing problems, and instead redirect them toward realizing opportunities.
Great, thank you. I'm getting several questions along the role of diversity, particularly, if you are a woman or a person of color moving into an executive role in an industry in which you are the minority. How do you recommend, what advice would you give to executive candidates working on executive presidents, or negotiating those racial or cultural differences and potential clashes in that type of work environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously on the top of a lot of people's minds today. I have a couple thoughts on that. The first is to give some serious attention to your professional network. Take stock of your network, take inventory of your network, and find organizations of like-minded people that you can join and become a part of. They are going to be your greatest source of creative approaches to how to overcome biases and prejudice in the workplace. Many of them have struggled with this already and have discovered better and worse ways to address these challenges. So my first suggestion would be to identify some networking groups in the local area that you can join and become a part of. The other is to find a mentor. And in this particular case, I would recommend finding a mentor rather than a coach. I mean, you can always work with a coach, but one of the distinctions that differentiates a mentor from a coach is a mentor is someone who has already progressed well along the path you are now beginning to progress along. Again, it's that executive trajectory. They've lived it. They've experienced the kinds of challenges that you are going to be facing. Find a mentor whose background, experience, cultural affinity, and identification are as closely aligned with your own, and set up a coffee with them. Invite them to have a cup of coffee and explain to them why you're inviting them to coffee, and kind of explain why you feel that they might be helpful to your own career. I think we tend to underestimate how much people enjoy being asked to help other people out. And in particular, we love to be asked to mentor other people. You know, in addition to the coaching work that I do, I serve as a mentor to three, I guess they're millennials. I'm not sure exactly how old one of them is, but, and it's some of the most satisfying and rewarding work that I do. So find the right networks, professional networks to join, and then find a mentor that you think is going to be able to help you understand the challenges that lie ahead for you, in large part because they've already lived them.
Excellent. And I'm seeing several questions about how do you find a mentor? How do you make that ask? We are going to have a webinar all about that on November 21st. So this will be on our website and included in an email. I do encourage you all to attend if you want some more information on how to actually make that ask. So Eric, again, we have so many wonderful questions. I'm going to give one last one and then we'll close up. What advice would you give if you're in an executive role, but a lot of your subordinates have more information and experience with the work than you do?
Yeah, well, I hope that happens a lot to you. You know, one of the rules that I've always tried to observe when I was building a team is to try to hire people who are smarter than I am, because that almost always ends up helping me become more successful. You know, along those lines of mentoring, there's a wonderful new trend which is called reverse mentoring. And reverse mentoring is finding people who are younger than you are to help you understand what you don't understand and learn what you haven't yet learned. It's become particularly popular as technology has come to play an increasingly important role in our professional lives. And so I think it's a great idea to approach one or two of these individuals and just have a very honest and candid conversation with them and say, I'm very impressed by what you know about this particular topic or this particular discipline or this particular technology. Would you consider serving as a mentor to me? And you know, once the look of astonishment passes over their face, they are going to be thrilled by this. So do not in any way feel embarrassed or intimidated by asking people who are lower in the organization than you are or younger than you are to help you figure out the work you have to do, because that is going to dramatically increase the level of trust and respect that they have in you as an executive.
What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you everyone who joined us today. You know, we are going to have lots of other offerings throughout the rest of Career Month, and it is all thanks to wonderful volunteers like you, Eric, and for all of you attendees for joining us during your lunch hour. So please stay tuned. We will have a follow-up thank you email with the recording of this webinar and a list of other things that you can join into for the rest of this month. But thank you very much to everyone who attended. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.